and welcome to our lecture over the High Empire of Ancient Rome. So, we discussed artworks from the Republic, the early Empire, and now we're going to be in the High Empire, focusing on Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. We're still in the time period of our Pax Romana. We say that, but essentially there are still battles going on outside of Rome. But life is generally good. And the late empire is defined by more the fall of Rome. But let's focus on the High Empire. And we'll be discussing a few of the 5 good emperors of the High Empire. Began with Nerva, then Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and then Marcus Aurelius. So here we have Emperor Trajan. He reigned from 98 to 117, and it was under his rulership in which Rome became its most expansive. This is the height of the empire, and you can see how far and wide their territory stretched. He, like Augustus, is recognized not only by his individualized face, but by this haircut, which is characteristic of him. So he was originally from Spain. He's one of our few outsiders until later on in the late empire. He was a general and a governor. He gained respect and favor with his soldiers and the Emperor Nerva, who chose him as his successor, which was supported by the people and by his troops. He expanded the empire to its greatest extent, and he conquered the formidable people of Dacia. So these Dacians, they were basically 2 wars back to back, and they were formidable foes. This was a long and arduous war. And they brought back the spoils of war, which helped to fund the public projects that he reigned over. And he was known as a strict but fair ruler. So again, he's one of our 5 good emperors, which hopefully we recognize that nomenclature of the 5 good emperors indicates that the ones after them aren't so good. So here we have Apollodorus of Damascus, think modern day Syria. And so he was the main architect and engineer for the Forum of Trajan that we'll study and the buildings that we'll focus on. He had an extensive career. He had been already working under Emperor Trajan. One thing to note is that one of the reasons why the Roman army was able to conquer so much of the world was because of their engineering feats. And much of this was thanks to Apollodorus of Damascus under Trajan's rule. Be it that they had to cross a river, so he was in charge of building a bridge, such as this one on the Danube, modern-day Germany, but against these Dacians. Well, it goes through other countries. But anyway, so he was this incredible engineer, and one of the reasons why the Roman army was so good at conquering areas was because of engineering. So he was in charge of the forum. So these spoils that they took from the region of Dacia, right here in this yellow, is a wealthy area, and so the spoils that they took back helped fund this massive forum and his market. So here are the forum and markets of Trajan. Here are the markets. We won't really be studying that, but just note that it really helped the economy of ancient Rome. And here's some artistic reconstructions. Here is the massive forum that we'll be studying, focusing on a few structures such as the Basilica Ulpia and our column of Trajan. So here's what is left of it, unfortunately. Essentially, all these structures across ancient Rome were reused during the medieval ages for Christian churches. So if you were to go to Rome and go to the Vatican City and enter into St. Peter's Basilica, you would have a good idea of what these ancient Roman structures would have looked like on the interior because those items were recycled. So here is part of our forum. Okay, so forums, this is one of about 10 that were in ancient Rome. And in fact, this was built upon previous ones. So the forum is the city center of ancient Rome. It's the open civil space. There were always going to be a temple that was close to these civic spaces. In other words, there was no separation between church and state, in this case, temples. Like we had already discussed, there was the state religion. And so we see that here, where this is the civic, judicial, and social heart of the ancient Rome, but it always included a temple as well. These forms could be found in any Roman city across their empire. Now, when I talk about civic architecture, I'm talking more about the law courts, the libraries, these public monuments, and so this form incorporates all of those. We're going to study a couple libraries, the law center, a temple, and this open area here. Here's what remains. You can see what it looked like, this white marble floor. So let's talk about the Basilica Oppia. The Basilica Oppia is important to study because this is what later churches are based upon. So if we're looking at the plan, here is what's called the nave, right here down the center. It's surrounded by these columned side aisles. And then these semicircle areas at the ends are called an apse. So our later Christian churches, which we'll study in our last couple units, mostly consist of a nave, side aisles, and a singular apse. In this case, we have both. And right next to it is, we'll study our column of Trajan, which is surrounded by a Greek and Latin library. Beyond here would be the temple. So originally this basilica was the law courts, and so this would be where you would go for any type of court proceedings. This was the largest basilica in Rome. We can still see some of it today. There are some columns standing. It would have been filled with sculptures and carvings, freestanding sculptures, and beside it was 2 libraries. But let's talk about this entrance to it, because we have coin examples of it. We can see this artistic reconstruction here. And it's the main square of the forum was once this vast space, and in order to enter behind it, where we have Trajan's column, our smaller forum, surrounded by the 2 libraries, and entering the temple, you would have had to go through this entrance, this porch of the basilica. And so what we have here is this very grand entryway. You'll notice that it has these yellow columns here. Those columns were later repurposed, again, in St. Peter's Basilica. We can see them here. And other coins attest to what it looked like. So that's what we're basing our understanding upon of it. And so to enter, you'd go through the south and this massive, almost triumphal arch, essentially, which was surmounted by a statue of Trajan riding this triumphal chariot. It would have been surrounded by these massive, colossal statues of victory, and as well as other massive statues of these 2-horse chariots. And so it was this grand entrance to, again, like most of the artwork that we've studied, attesting to Trajan's military accomplishments as well as his power. I mean, just with how elaborate and decorative this whole entire forum is, attests to his power and the wealth that he accumulated for Rome. Here's an artist's reconstruction of the interior. Now note in the center there would have been this equestrian statue. We'll study the one of Marcus Aurelius later. Most of these were, of course, bronze. Consider the size of it and the details. And they were melted down during the medieval period. So let's briefly discuss the column of Trajan. So that is right here. And it was flanked by a temple, a library on either side, one Greek, one Latin, and our Basilica Oppia. So the height of the libraries, if you were to enter them and walk up to the second level, this is how you would be able to see the images around our column of Trajan. So the column of Trajan is 125 feet tall, and this marks where there originally would have been a hill here. So where this forum was formed, there was this massive 125-foot hill. There were other smaller forums built by previous emperors and rulers. Near it is actually Julius Caesar's forum. But Apollo of Damascus, it was quite the engineering feat to remove this extremely tall hill. And so the height of this column is representative of that. It is also paying respect to Apollodorus of Damascus's engineering abilities. Now let's start with the base before we go into this narrative frieze. And this base would have actually housed the remains, the ashes, of Emperor Trajan and his wife. They no longer exist to this day, but just note that this would have housed, it was essentially a tomb. So Trajan's column is essentially propaganda. It reveals on this relief the two back-to-back wars against the Dacians. The Romans defeated them each time, but it was a formidable war. The narrative itself is this long spiraling narrative. If we were to take it and roll it out, it would be over. I've read different arguments about its length, but generally the consensus is that it's 625 feet long. It includes over 2,500 figures. There's 150 scenes, and Trajan appears 58 times. Now, the interesting part, and what's new, is that there's no hierarchy of scale difference between Emperor Trajan and his troops. So this is such a testament to how he felt about his troops, is that he greatly respected them. He didn't see himself as above them. Hence why he's one of our good emperors and why he was chosen to be emperor, because he definitely had the support of his troops. He was an extremely competent general, and his troops greatly supported him. He was respectful to them, obviously, and we see that in the art here. And this is also the first narrative frieze that spirals upward. After this, there are numerous other artworks and emperors that utilize this long spiraling upward frieze. There's also these interesting attempts at portraying aerial perspective. And, like most items in the ancient world, it would have been colored. So here we have this image of our Roman soldier and our Dacian. And hopefully you recognize the differences. We have our Roman and our full military regalia. Consider back to our Augusta Suprema Porta, and on his breastplate where he had the the personification of Rome in the full regalia versus the just clothed enemy. Here we have the same thing where these Dacians likely would have had their own armor, but they're being portrayed with this wild hair, these longer beards, and they're not in the same military regalia that the Romans had. They aren't they don't have the same military might that the Romans do. So much of this is a testament, again, to the engineering feats of the Roman army. They had to face the obstacle of crossing the Danube River, and so they built a bridge. Apollodorus of Damascus was a part of that, and so we see that here. This larger figure, we do obviously have our hierarchy of scale, but that's the personification of this river. So they're shown conquering it. They're going over him. We can see parts of the bridge right here. And just take a moment to appreciate this sense of space. We have our foreground, our middle ground, our background. We're showing this big city in which they're conquering. So we're going to look at a few slides of examples of this attempt at depicting an aerial view. So we're not overlapping with like a middle ground, foreground, and background. Instead, these figures are supposed to be like this semi-aerial view where they're chopping down these trees to create this bridge. We see much of this column is a testament to this engineering that the Roman army was capable of. And so here we have this aerial view trying to give us the idea of just how expansive this forest was that they were chopping down, of how they were all working quickly and together to create this eventual bridge that they went over. We can see our Trajan right here. Notice how his outfit is very similar to our Augustus of Prima Porta, and his haircut is indicative, or is characteristic of him. Here's another example of an aerial view where they're on these boats, and so they're crossing, and so this isn't supposed to be that they're higher up. Instead, it's supposed to be this angled aerial view that we see here. Again, so they're building this wall to create this fort. And there is our forum. So let's move on to Hadrian, where we will be looking at the Pantheon. So some of your notes are from the assigned videos. I like how they present the Pantheon because it's hard to understand it in just picture form. So I like the digital reconstructions. So he is one of our good emperors, and what is new about him? He has this beard. This is called the philosopher's beard. We'll see the next couple emperors have this beard as well. He sets the trend. And so it's called a philosopher's beard because these ancient Greek philosophers had beards. It indicates wisdom to an extent. And so we're seeing Hadrian in this thoughtful regard where he's studying philosophy, etc. And he's one of our good emperors, so he's well respected. He was a patron of many projects where he's reconstructing Rome, and we'll talk about how this is actually one of those examples. So the Pantheon is one of the best preserved Roman buildings. Many art historians argue that it's the most important architectural building ever built, that it changed the world. This dome changed the world. It's influenced many famous architects, even Michelangelo, Thomas Jefferson in America built numerous structures based off of this. And so what we see in the front here is this Agrippa, this inscription says, Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, consul 3 times, made this. Okay, well, I just said that Hadrian made it. So what's going on here? This inscription confused early archaeologists. And so there was originally a structure here that was built by Agrippa. Okay, he was a previous emperor or a consul. And so what happened was that it was actually destroyed by a fire and rebuilt by Hadrian. So he was known as a strong patron of the arts. He really invested in the reconstruction and refurbishment of several ancient monuments around Rome. And so his contemporary historians discuss how this really attests to his modesty, that he rebuilt this structure that we're seeing, but he didn't add his name to it. He's still giving credit to the original person who sponsored it. Now, the reason why it stands compared to these other structures that were taken down it was abandoned for a few hundred years, but in the 7th century, it was actually consecrated as a church. So it was used as a Christian church for centuries, and so that's why it lasted. Now, I want to talk about these red periphery columns. They're called red periphery. They look more purple in real life. I've been there a few times. You can see how massive they are. I mean, they just tower over these people. And so these columns come from Egypt. So this red periphery is this rare, expensive stone from Egypt. And it was expensive because there wasn't much of it. It was expensive to transport. So this in itself is a testament to the wealth of the ancient Roman Empire at this time period, that they were able to export or import this item. However, the problem is that we can see here, look at on the actual facade of the building, we have this pediment. But then yet the porch in our frontal pediment is shorter. So what happened was in Egypt, where they would carve these columns and then ship them over, is they actually got the measurements wrong and they were made too short. again, this stone is extremely expensive, so it's not like they could order a whole nother set of these columns for this porch, so they just went with it. But we can see this mistake right here. The Romans loved this material so much that they actually, it pretty much went extinct. They used all of it. There's no more red porphyry in Egypt. Also note the Corinthian capitals. I said the Romans loved those. Now remember how I pointed out briefly the oculus, this opening in Nero's Golden Palace, which within this octagonal room? We see that again here within our Pantheon, the oculus. So this is in the center of the dome. It allows light into this structure. Otherwise, it would have been quite dark. It also was an opening for smoke to escape during sacrificial burnings. Consider how this also adds a spiritual element where it's moving and shifting, and you can see the rays of the sun throughout the day, and so it adds this ethereal, spiritual aspect to it. Now, the reason how they were able to create this dome, you'll get this in those videos, is that they used various types of stone and volcanic rock and to create this concrete. And so on the bottom, it would have been heavier stones, and then as you move up and up and up, you're more into your pumice, lighter, porous volcanic stone. And so the use of materials enabled them to create this dome, as well as our coffered ceilings. And so they were developed as a way to relieve the weight of the large dome. Coffers are these series of these sunken panels in the shape of a square, sometimes a rectangle or an octagon, that helps to relieve the weight. But check out the interior of this. So again, this is what all of these other structures would have looked like on the interior. All these different marble and details and columns and our small little niches where we would have had likely our pantheon of our Roman gods and goddesses. So from the videos, and I forgot to mention this at the beginning of this portion of the lecture, is pantheon refers to all of the gods. So we're still not exactly sure about the original temple purpose of this structure, but the best argument, or at least the consensus, is that it was dedicated to the great pantheon of the Roman gods, not just one single one. Hadrian had obviously a great respect for Greek culture, and so the circle, the square, exterior and interior mirror this Greek obsession with balance and perfection and harmony. And so Hadrian utilizes that in this architecture. Yeah, after the fall of the Roman Empire, it was pretty much abandoned for a few hundred years. But again, luckily in 609, it was consecrated as a Christian church. So hence why it lasts. So to wrap up our High Empire, we're going to discuss Marcus Aurelius, an incredible emperor. And he is utilizing that philosopher's beard. Look at how our figure style has changed slightly, where we're seeing some of his age. We can see this natural crease in his forehead. However, it is not exaggerated. It's not verism like our Roman Republic. Instead, it's a naturalistic portrayal of him. He's not necessarily idealized in his youth. We see the furrow, not the furrow of his brows, but we do see this slight crease to indicate age. And look at the chiseled out details of his hair and his beard. This helps you to recognize Marcus Aurelius. In fact, the length of his beard is longer than Hadrian, as you can see in his predecessor, Antonius Pius. But his beard basically creates this fad for beards during the Roman Empire. He was an incredibly well-respected emperor. He's one of the reasons why he's also emphasizing his beard is because he considered himself a philosopher in a very modest way. He actually wrote a book on philosophy, on Stoicism specifically. And this is an ancient Greek school of philosophy from Athens. And it teaches the development of self-control, fortitude, perseverance as a means of overcoming destructive emotions. And so it's based on clear reason, unbiased thinking, which allows one to make reasonable decisions. And we see that play out during his reign. So here we have this equestrian statue. It's bronze, which is interesting because we haven't seen many of those. They were melted down during the Middle Ages. However, the Christian church thought that this was a depiction of Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor. And so this is why it has lasted, was that confusion of identity. So lucky for us. So I should also mention that Marcus Aurelius is one of those heroes in history. So during his reign, we had the Antonine Plague. This was a massive epidemic. It killed about 5 to 10 million people, about 10% of the empire's population. They believe it came with the Roman army when they were in the Near East, because the Roman army was particularly hit. Any type of populated city was hit really hard. And so he was the ruler during this. And unlike other examples of major plagues in history, basically he didn't allow for dead bodies in the street when we consider the ancient world. And so he funded all these public projects for the amount of deaths that were occurring. Basically our version of their version of cemeteries just couldn't even keep up. And so he even sponsored cemeteries. He sponsored the removal of these deceased bodies. Him and his wife even sold off their jewelry to help sponsor taking care of the Roman people. It's believed that he actually even died from the Antonine Plague, but he was one of those heroes during it. He really did what was right throughout the whole plague compared to other emperors and rulers across the globe who didn't necessarily take care of their people. But anyway, so one of our great heroes, again, he was into Stoicism. He even wrote a book called On Meditations. Many modern day people who practice Stoicism look to his writings. So he was incredibly thoughtful. And we see that within his gaze on this equestrian statue. So equestrian statue. It would have been placed outside. Here's a copy. The original is inside a museum right next to it. But the equestrian statue, these were popular. Remember, we would have had one at Trajan's forum as well. Now let's consider what's going on here. Some should be familiar. His arm is extended. So think back to our Augustus Prima Porta, where he is likely speaking to a large crowd. So for the most part, this outstretched arm indicates speaking, that he had these good oratory skills. He practiced rhetoric well, be it to the general people or his troops. Either way, he's likely speaking. However, some art historians argue that he's reaching his arm out in this gesture of compassion and mercy. And there's some evidence that perhaps this was part of a whole sculptural depiction of someone who was on trial or who had done something wrong, who would be in front of him underneath where his hand is, and that his hand is protruding out above this person, granting him mercy. He was known as a compassionate, benevolent ruler, so we see that here. Notice how he's also not in his full military regalia. His horse is, but he is not. So he's not coming from this high and mighty aspect of trying to show his military might. He's more humbled, he's a thinker, he's more acting upon this plague that's rushing through his empire, and so he's showing his benevolence here and how he cares for the people. And we see this thoughtful expression in his face, where he's looking off into the distance, where he seems to be considering, he's serious. He's considering what's best for his people during this time period. And he's extremely individualized. You can recognize Marcus Aurelius in the mini busts that are still around in Rome today. I should say a barbarian underneath him. At least that's what there's some evidence of. So the size... Hold on, let me get my dog. So one thing to note is that he is showing himself as powerful when we consider the size of him compared to the horse. He's not riding a small little pony. Instead, he's shown as extremely large and in control of this horse. So notice how the horse is in movement. He would have been walking. You would need to be holding reins to control the horse like this, but he doesn't. He's in control. He's in control of himself, and he's able to demonstrate his power compared to the size of the horse. And so there wraps up our good emperors and our high empire.